All right. So, Gavin, thanks for joining me for another episode of the Make Work Better podcast. The reason I knew I had to have you on is I saw that you were writing a book. I've seen you promote it quite a bit on LinkedIn recently. And when I saw what your book was about, I'm like, I've got to have this guy on. Obviously, I know you personally. We were connected
Yeah.
quite a few years ago by a mutual friend, Jeff Henderson. We even did some work together at a
Yep.
previous company that I led. And you've been up to a lot lately, but you've also done a lot in the past, probably 10 or 15 years. Just high level, just tell the audience a little bit about like who you are and what you've been up to in the last few years.
Yeah, sure, man. Good to see you again, Will, as always. Yeah, well, I spent a decade in the marketplace after graduate undergraduate work in marketing, and loved doing consulting, but felt called into ministry, and so left the marketplace to get involved in ministry, and I've been doing that for about now 17, 18 years total, which it's been a good ride. But I spent a lot of that as a lead pastor at a church called Woodstock City Church, campus location of North Point Ministries, and working with Andy Stanley, as you know. But 3 years ago, just under 3 years ago, I left that role to kind of combine my previous consulting, work and I don't want to say expertise, but passion for that. My passion for leadership and leaders and organizational strategy and intentionality. And I've gone back in as a consultant now, taking really everything I learned as a pastor when it comes to leadership and coaching people and helping leaders move forward, and helping them be more intentional about their mission, more strategic about how they look at their teams, how they build culture, all those kinds of great things around organizational life. So that's what I'm doing now full time.
And as long as I've known you for just from your experience and the things that you've been able to accomplish, I've always thought here's a guy that could write a book on building things, on leading things, on transition, on succession, and everything else. So glad to see that you're doing it. Tell us, what was the genesis of that book? Where'd you get the idea for
Well,
that?
yeah, it's a great question. I have been through a few leadership transitions myself, but everybody has. I mean, we've all transitioned into something, out of something, multiple times in most cases. In fact, the data is showing it's happening more and more frequently, right? And unless you're a founder of an organization, every time you move into a leadership role, you are inheriting something that you did not create. You didn't start it. You got a group of people you didn't hire. You've got a culture you didn't create. You've got processes, systems, all these things that are in place. And so when you inherit all of that, it is so complicated. I've done it a few times myself as a point leader. I've also done it multiple times just within organizations through, smaller promotions and things like that. So as I was leaving Woodstock City Church and I was transitioning out, I was helping transition in the new leader, who was somebody who I had hired 7 years prior. So I had been kind of working to prepare him for this role for a long time. And he was the heir apparent, a fantastic leader. So as I began thinking through that, I realized how complicated it was going to be to replace me, not because I was so good or anything, but just because transitions are challenging and they're difficult. I was watching everybody in our church, all of our staff, everybody's getting nervous. They're uncomfortable. They don't know where this is going to, what it's going to mean for them. Where is this going to take the organization? So I began processing all that and realized this isn't just a me moment. This is an everyday moment across the world as people are transitioning in and out of leadership spaces and having to deal with all the things they inherit. And by the way, they're the problem, because if the old guy would have just stayed, if the predecessor would have stayed, all of this would not be happening right now. So how do we help leaders transition well out? Part of the book's about that, but how do we help them transition into organizations, eventually out? How do we help them understand what everybody on their team, division, department, or even organization is feeling during this transition? Practically, tactically, and also, and this is crazy to hear me say this, I think, if you will, you know me, but emotionally, what are people feeling emotionally? And how do we as leaders tap into that so that we can lead them better through this process? So the genesis is part of it is my own experience, but really it's from talking to leaders for now 2+ decades and watching all of these transitions become so complicated, so frequent, and yet done so poorly. How could I step into that space and potentially give some practical, tactical advice on how to do it better?
The title of your book is Big Shoes to Fill, Stepping into a Leadership Role Without Stepping in It. And the book doesn't come out till January 16th. We're recording this in December. So I'm going to throw a slide up on the screen right now showing everybody what that book looks like and where they can get it. So yeah, the subtitle, Stepping into a Leadership Role Without Stepping in It. I think you might have left a couple of letters off of that last word. I think we all get what you're referring to there. Um, so I read the book, and you mentioned very eloquently about transitions, and I think you suggested there's a this is an increasing thing, right? You said everybody knows that it has experienced something like this. I can tell you that in my professional career, I have been with a couple of big, well-known organizations that have gone through a massive transition and in some cases leadership succession.
Right.
And I can tell you, in none of those situations was it a good thing at the time. And sometimes the lingering impact of that lasted 10 or 15 years after. I
Correct.
mean, we're talking about earth-shaking kind of things where the organization was left in such a state that it was never the same again. And so, if somehow as organizational leaders, if we can get better at this, or at least understand, or not, at least not be unrealistic about it, at least not
Right.
think, hey, we're just going to go through this major transition succession and everything's going to be fine. No, I think we need to embrace the reality that it's not going to be fine
Yeah,
because,
and leaders are bad about this. I'm one of these where we say, well, we're just going to cast a really compelling vision, and it's going to be so inspiring that everyone will be on board. They'll forget about the past. The
mm,
beloved or the bemoaned leader. It doesn't matter. I mean, now I'm here. Everybody's going to be excited. And the reality is, no matter how good you are, no one knows that yet. So
yeah,
you're the problem. You're stepping in, and you are creating the resistance. Your presence is the resistance. And so
mhm,
it's so complex to do that well. And by the way, like you just said, Will, and I've been through it too, because we have been through these experiences before, and often, almost always, so poorly that they are led. When we are about to go into another one, we don't walk in with any level of excitement or enthusiasm. We've been through this. We know how this is going to go. So, what ultimately happens, and this is what we're trying to avoid moving forward, but in the past, what has happened is new leader steps in, and it may be over just of a team. It could be of a larger, department, division, or maybe even an entire organization. But the new leader steps in because they don't know or they can't articulate, express what's going to happen. They're unsure. Everybody's unsure. The amount of unknowns continue to pile up. They're casting vision. It's not working. You end up, and this is the hard part. The organization can make it through, but it ends up being a different organization because all the people who are carrying the culture, the greatest leaders you have around you, the greatest teammates, they all leave because they're not willing to put up with all that. And I hate to say it, but you end up keeping the people you really don't want to keep. You end up losing the people you need the most. So therefore, the organization becomes a brand new organization because you end up just hiring a bunch of new people and starting over on some level.
what I love about the book is that it seems to be equal parts principles, like as in timeless principles regarding leadership and transition. And also, I love the fact that you pull a lot of current data, statistics, and trends. So, in the early chapters of your book, here are some statistics that you lay out that I think are critical to understanding the importance of leadership transitions. And they do have to do with the increasingly transient nature of work today. So, for instance, you mentioned in the book that 91% of millennials expect to change jobs every 3 years. While I would say that is definitely different than, say, our generation, Generation X, it's far different than this preceding generations, right? Um,
Absolutely.
and then you also mentioned that a job, and here's the reality, and I think this is part of the reason why you see the likelihood of increasing job change. A job change that's a base salary increase between 10.1 and 20% over a typical 2 to 4% merit increase, which of course is increasing the job transitions. You then go on to say a long career with a single organization is unlikely, perhaps impossible. Today's leaders experience many transitions, and transitioning well is critical in this environment. My question to you is, do you see this trend increasing or decreasing, and why?
Well, I I wish I could be a prognosticator and tell you exactly what's going to happen. I don't think any of us, we all pretend we know, but we don't really know, right? But if the trend has been trending in this direction for a long time, this is not a brand new trend. Now, of course, anytime there's a crisis, think trends get accelerated. Very few get created, but they get accelerated. Of course, so the 2020, 2021 pandemic crisis accelerated a lot of these trends. But if I had to guess, and I think I can do this pretty safely, I don't think it's going to decrease. And the reason is that some of the metrics in the book I talk about really are what's driving this. The salary increases, the opportunity to work in different ways. You mentioned the previous generation. I mean, this is a great example. My father and my mom and dad, they're in their mid upper 70s. When I went to college, the first thing they told me was pick a practical major. And the reason is because that's what you did. If you went to college or you went to a trade school, you did something, but it was practical. You went to work in a practical company doing practical work. You got a 2 to 4% raise every year. You maybe got promoted occasionally. Most people changed jobs once, maybe twice along their career. And the reason is that you were building a 401k, you were looking towards retirement. I mean, there was this selfish side of that, I mean, I don't mean it badly. The selfishness looks differently today. There was this is what's better for me. That's how it worked back then. However, one of the key differences, and this is why I don't see it decreasing, one of the key differences today that we did not see maybe in a previous generation was the loyalty to a company and the loyalty to an organization or a leader. Our entire culture has moved away from that. It's not a culture of honor and loyalty anymore. And again, we could pontificate why and if it's good or not, but the reality is it's true. And so if you can make more money by changing jobs, people will. If you can get a promotion, if you can, the whole thing is going to end. It just continues to drive forward that way because it creates more opportunity for the individual. And we are now in an individualistic society, right? Not a corporate society, not an organizational society. So I don't think it's going to decrease. Now, how much more can it increase? I mean, if you think about a millennial currently changing, and they're expecting to change, it doesn't mean they are. But another metric, so three every 3 years. Another metric, though, Will said that if you look at the entire workforce in general, they change jobs every 4.1 years. And that's an actual change, not they hope to change. So they're changing at a minimum 4.1. They want to do it even faster. So I don't think it's going to decrease. Now, the real question is, could you even, companies, though, also have to hire you. So you may want to change jobs, but if no one wants to hire you, you can't change if you're unhireable. Changing every year makes you pretty unhireable. You have a history of that. It becomes problematic. I think it's going to have to settle out somewhere, but I bet it settles around 3 to 4 years. And so that's where we'll find ourselves, which is where we are now.
Yeah, which is a huge difference from the 30 to 40 years that, again,
Right.
preceding generations experience.
Right. Well, think about this, Will. I don't dig as much into this in the book because it's mostly about the point leader and how you transition in, how you deal with the team, how you, practically, tactically do all that. But, just from an organizational perspective, think about how detrimental it is to a company to have that level of turnover. You're trying to maintain a culture. You're trying to maintain some semblance of team and chemistry. It's impossible. The amount of money companies are spending today on just recruiting and training, and they can't retain, but they have to replace. So the recruiting and training budgets have got to just be massive now compared to what they were a decade or so ago.
Yeah. One of the things I love about your book, and you just mentioned it, you really wrote this for the point leader, the one that's transitioning in. Like, how do they
Right.
handle this new leadership role, given that there is a succession that has taken place? And so you give a lot of great and timeless leadership principles. And as I mentioned before, though, you kind of update it for the new reality that is today. Well, you quote John Maxwell in your book, and you reference him more than once, as a matter of
Yeah.
fact. And he happens to be the world's foremost leadership expert. And I love this quote because there's a lot of quotables, right, from John Maxwell, but I love this one that you chose. You chose leaders must be close enough to relate to others, but far enough ahead to motivate them. How
Mhm.
well do you think most people in positions of leadership understand that? And better yet, where do most people in positions of authority err on that spectrum? Are they too close, too far ahead?
Well, I think we see a lot of both, Will. I think we see I talk about this in the book, obviously, but the difference between positional authority and relational influence. So another quote from John: "Leadership is influence." And so I think our personalities often dictate if we bend a little more positional driven or relational driven. However, in this changing demographic and world we're in, the more relational driven leader is finding more success. Positional authority doesn't work to inspire people forward. You may get people to do something because you told them to, but you're not inspiring something bigger than just the task. So therefore, leaders who are moving more towards relational influence are the ones who are gaining success in this marketplace dynamic that we're seeing today. And part of that's generational, the Gen X a little bit, but certainly our millennial and Gen Z generation are much more attracted to a relationally driven leader than a positional authority leader. And so it is critical to balance that, though. Here's the other reality. If you're the leader, you're not just one of the gang. And I think that's one of the potential missteps that we might see with some of our younger generation leaders, because you are a relational driven leader potentially, but it doesn't mean that you can have the same level of relationship that everyone else in the team can have. Because by the way, you're still the leader, you're still the boss, and you have to keep that in mind. So that's why I love that quote by Maxwell. We don't want to be so far ahead that we have no relational connection and therefore no real influence outside of the title or the name tag that we're wearing. At the same time, we can't pretend we're just one of the team and we're just one of the guys, one of the girls, and our words don't weigh anymore. Our opinion doesn't carry any more weight. That's silly to think that, right? So it really is a balancing act. And if I could borrow another great leader, Andy Stanley, it's tensions to manage. It's just tension to manage. You can't drift too far to one side or the other. So when I'm coaching leaders, one of the interesting conversations I frequently have is helping them evaluate which side they naturally drift to, and then how do we find a better balance in that, and not just be the default version of kind of who we are. Not that we don't want to be us, but we want to be the best version of us for the leadership role that we're in. So finding that balance becomes pretty critical.
I have some questions for you in a few minutes about tensions to manage, because I think this is something you could have written in fact, I say you could have written an entire book on just the tensions to manage part, and it's actually a good deal of your book, and I appreciate it. I'm like,
Yeah.
finally,
I have
someone's
two full
actually.
chapters just on that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Yeah.
I also think you'll agree, because you also touched on the definitions of leadership, because again, John Maxwell's definition, although he probably has 1,000, the one that he's most known for saying is that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. I think you agree, and you also say so in your book, that there are as many definitions of leadership as there are people with opinions. I've always liked what Louis Giglio answered once. I think he was on the Carey Nieuwhof leadership podcast. I think Carey said, "Hey, what's leadership to you, or what makes leaders different?" And what he said was very definitive, but it was very different. He said, "At the end of the day, I think leaders create."
Yeah.
Basically leaders create. So in chapter 2 of your book, you give a bullet list for some of the things that leaders create. Can you unpack some of those for us here?
Yeah, well, I talk in that chapter, and maybe one day we'll do a whole book on this. I love this topic of leadership and management because they are words that often are used interchangeably, and they're very different. They're distinctly different. And so when I'm comparing these two things, the reason it's in the book, Will, is because as a leader stepping into this role that you didn't create, you're inheriting all these things. You're inheriting the organization, the structures, the systems, all the things that are in place. And so I mean, I'll list some things in a second, but before I do, the key difference is that leaders do create, that innovate, organizations manage. The goal of the organization is to create systems and processes so that the idea can scale, the product, the service, the whatever can scale. However, the minute you organize something, it locks it in time in a way. And the organization or management, therefore, because organizations need managers, and managers are there to do one thing, to keep what currently is operating effectively and efficiently. That's what managers do. And they do it very well. And we need those people. However, leaders are creators. Every organization started with a leader and an idea, and it was just an idea. To scale the idea, we had to organize the idea, which then meant we had to bring managers in with the job of keeping what is functioning well. However, as the world changes, which it does constantly, as customer preferences, taste change, as the culture changes, whatever it may be, The leader wants to change along with that culture change, wants to change with the customer preference change. Yet all of these management people are now trying to restrict change to a, Frank Blake said this, plus or minus 5% when I interviewed him. Frank was the former CEO of the Home Depot. And he said everybody can tolerate about 4 to 5% of change. That's it. And the reason is because of management. Management exists to keep things from changing. The goal is to make it effective and efficient. So that's what managers do, right? They're tasked with keeping what is currently going. And so I have a list of things they do, but that's the genesis of it is that, right? They want to keep things going the way it's going. They want to keep things functioning the way it's functioning. Meanwhile, leaders are wanting to create, they're wanting to innovate, they're wanting to ideate, they're looking not at what currently is, they're looking at the future of what could be. And that's what leaders do. They're progress oriented, right? Whereas the management side is execution oriented.
Yeah. In fact, in that chapter, you write, this is a direct quote from your book, organizations are the results of ideas needing order. And one of the things that, you talk about is that there is a cost to that order, which I think you just addressed, which is
Right.
their organizations are great at managing, at bringing systems, at bringing execution. But as soon as something needs to change, they're just not good at it because that's not what they were created to do or intended to do.
Right.
So when I think of the word organization, and I'll be honest with you, there seems to be a through line, a common thread with a lot of the guests that I've had on this interview show, and with a lot of people that I've had conversations with lately, and by the way, including a future guest of the Chick-fil-A Corporation, and you have a history with Chick-fil-A. So why don't you
I
share a
do.
little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I was very blessed to have a history with Chick-fil-A. My mother, when I was 7 years old, went to work at Chick-fil-A's corporate headquarters. And so I was a little kid running around with Truett, Kathy, and Dan, and Bubba, and his family. And I think she was the 30 or 40th employee at Chick-fil-A corporate, and she stayed for 30 years. And so I really did have a chance to grow up with that organization, that company. And then after after my MBA program, I had an opportunity to run a small business where Chick-fil-A became my largest client. So I did a lot of direct marketing with them, direct mail back in the day when we used snail mail for things like that. So we ran their national campaign and grand opening direct mail programs. I got to do that for them and did a lot of strategic marketing consulting with the Chick-fil-A marketing department as well. So I have a pretty long history with them. Yes.
Awesome. Well, the reason I bring up your history with Chick-fil-A is that there is a story you tell in the book about the early days of Chick-fil-A,
Yeah.
specifically about the relationship between founder, the idea guy, Truett Cathy, and an early operations manager who was with the organization for like 50 years or something, Jimmy
Right.
Collins.
Right.
And a lot of people that are really familiar with Chick-fil-A story know about Truett, they know about Jimmy. But this is something I had no idea. When I read it in your book, I learned it for the first time, and that was, and I think a lot of people that are at least our age, and certainly those that are older than us, have heard of Morrison's Cafeteria. The people
Mhm.
probably 35, 40, maybe younger are like, Morrison's, what's that? But there is a story in there about how Chick-fil-A might not have ever come to be the way that we know it today because of an
Right.
offer that was made to Truett by Morrison's. You want to tell us about that story?
That's shocking, Will. When I discovered that myself, I had to read it twice too. So as the story goes, Truett Cathy invents the chicken sandwich. It's the most delicious thing I've ever eaten, still to this day. I love it. I grew up working in Chick-fil-A stores too and doing grand openings. So when I say it's in me, it's definitely in me. So Truett has this idea. He's serving it at this one location. He has an inkling to maybe expand a little bit, but Truett is an unbelievable entrepreneur. I mean, he's been an entrepreneur since he was a child. And so the idea guy is Truett, and he's full of great ideas. The problem is that to effectively scale an idea, you can't just keep making ideas. You have to bring order to it. And so Jimmy Collins is consulting at the time as he's a food restaurant consultant, and he begins talking to Truett about this. So they begin having this, interaction. Jimmy's working for Truett as a consultant, as a contractor for a season. And all the while thinking maybe this could be something bigger than what it is today. Truett feels that could certainly be true. In the middle of all of these conversations, Morrison's Cafeteria, which again, most people might not know about, it's kind of a meat and three kind of place, right? So they approach Truett and want to purchase the rights and everything that comes with it, and hire him to be a Morrison's employee running the Chick-fil-A brand under the Morrison's umbrella. And he doesn't know what to do. And it's a very lucrative offer. And so to help make the decision, he's become friends with Jimmy Collins, who's, again, working for him as a consultant, goes to Jimmy. They have this conversation, and he asks Jimmy, how would you feel about coming to work for me at Morrison's, basically? And Jimmy says, I have no interest in doing that. But if you want to do this on your own, then I'd be happy to consider it. So in a lot of, in a real way, and according to Jimmy, Jimmy's the one who tells this story. According to Jimmy, Truett was really leaning towards the Morrison's deal. I mean, he was going to have autonomy over the brand, at least for a while, but he was going to be engulfed in this much larger organization. And so who knows what would have happened long term. But I think Truett, in his ingenuity, also knew that he wasn't a manager and he wasn't the person to scale this on his own. He's a leader, he's an innovator, an idea guy. So Morrison's was going to fill that role for him. And I think that was probably a comforting idea, comforting thought, right? Well, of course, Jimmy comes in and says, I'm happy to do that for you. And let's not let Morrison's be the management. Let me do that. And so that's how Jimmy gets involved. They decide to go into business together. And of course, the rest is history, is Chick-fil-A, right? But growing up around that place, it was so fun. Again, now as an adult, I can look back and see it. But how many times Truett had an idea that then the management, they had to work together on how do we take this forward? All of these new restaurant concepts that they have, that Chick-fil-A has had over the years, all Truett's brainchild, right? Introducing new products, all of these things that were happening, it took the idea person and the orchestration person to truly bring it to fruition. And that's how Truett and Jimmy worked, together.
Yeah, speaking of that, all the new restaurant ideas, there is about a mile from where I'm sitting right now, something called Truett's Luau, which is a Hawaiian themed Chick-fil-A restaurant. In case,
Exactly.
so for those in leadership, because again, Chick-fil-A is studied a lot by leaders and those that are studying leadership. Just when you think you've heard every Chick-fil-A story, again, the one that you shared in your book is one that I had no idea about. Now, in addition to that, so another thing I like about your book that I think makes it unique is that you have some nuggets of gold from some very well-known and successful leaders. There are people like Cheryl Batchelder of Popeye's Chicken, Dave Katz of Coca-Cola, Frank Wren, who was a former Major League Baseball general manager, and you've mentioned him several times already, Frank Blank, who's the CEO of Home Depot, and that's just to name a few. There are others in there. But tell me more about the lesson that Frank shared about the centripetal force of the organization. I found this very enlightening.
Well, as Frank and I chatted, and that guy, he's so brilliant, right? Frank walked into Home Depot during a very tough season. And Frank's a GE guy, so he came from GE, had gone through some government stuff, had done some pretty. I mean, this guy's background is just spectacular. So walks into Home Depot. Half of the leadership team are former GE people, and half the leadership team are longtime Home Depot people. So there was automatic tension and problems sitting even at the leadership table. This is not the question you asked, but just really quickly, he ended up having to jettison the GE people, of which he was one, to keep the Home Depot people, because he didn't want to lose the Home Depot culture, because it was Home Depot, not GE part two. So there's a whole interesting thing about that too. So when Frank walked in, a lot of things needed to be done differently. There were lots of opportunities to refocus on the customer, refocus on the employee, so many opportunities to do things. At the same time, all of those different initiatives required new thinking and then therefore new behaving. So it's change. And so Frank talked a lot about how organizations, so companies, it doesn't matter, right? However we define an organization, a company, a church, a business, that the bigger they are, the harder it is for them to evolve, because again, there's more management and there's more processes and systems. Home Depot is massive when Frank gets there. He said that the internal forces are constantly working against innovation and progress, because the vast majority of people who are working there are doing what they have been hired to do, and they don't want to do it differently because they understand it. So every department, every division, every even employee, the force is just the natural force is to keep things going the way they are, which is why he said, You can change something 2, 3, 4, maybe 5% before people start getting really panicked. And that's what he experienced over and over at Home Depot.
Yeah. And I mentioned this, I mentioned a few minutes ago that we would get to this, the whole idea of tensions to manage versus problems to solve. And so this is one of the most
Yeah.
insightful principles that you kind of camp out on for a couple chapters in your book. About this, you write, too many times leadership sees every issue as a problem. Problems demand solutions, and good leaders solve problems. But if an issue is less problem and more tension, providing a solution does do more damage than we may realize. Tensions are powerful. They help keep our organization and leadership in balance. If we solve a tension, we lose the power of the stretch and pull. Now, and one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk about this subject with you today is that I've been talking about this with the organizational leaders behind the scenes for quite some time. And the first time I heard about managing tensions and what it has to do with leadership, effective leadership, was I was reading a book about 10 years ago or so called Relaunch, and it's by a guy by the name of Dr. Mark Rutland. And his book Relaunch is about organizational turnarounds. And in it, he talks about how a lot of people, when they show up and they say, "Hey, we're going to turn this around," or even if they're building something from scratch, they say, "Okay, let's build something. Here's how we're going to build it." He said, effective leadership is less about building something, and it's more about managing tensions. And the principle that he uses in his book is that within every organization, no matter what, if it's a business or nonprofit, whatever, you have two forces. One is control and the other is chaos. Leaders, producers, they tend to provide the chaos in an organization, and you have your accountants, lawyers, et cetera, that provide the
It's leadership and
control.
management, Will, is what we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Those two things.
Yes.
It's just,
Uh,
yeah, I mean, leaders create chaos and managers create order.
what do you think are some good organizational examples of tensions to manage? And by
Yeah.
the way, you've mentioned like 2 dozen in your book. So if you just want to pick one of those,
Yeah.
one or two of
Well,
those,
I'll
that'd be
pick
great.
my favorite one was when I was talking to Cheryl Batchelder with Popeyes. She talked about when she arrived at Popeyes. I mean, it was quite a mess, and so there was a lot of cleaning up to do. The first thing she did, and I write extensively about this, but she went on a listening tour, and so she spent several weeks, months, really, going and listening, but not just to the people who work directly for her. She is going on the road into stores, sitting with customers, listening to their experience, listening to the frontline cashier worker, listening to the day manager, listening to the franchise owner, and listening to the corporate entities as well. And so what she found is that, and this is true of every franchise or multi-site church or whatever it may be, it's the same story, but the central team, so in her case, Popeye's corporate, wanted more control. They wanted to control the way everything happens at the local store. Well, I'll give you one guess as to how all the local store owners and operators wanted to behave. There was too much control. They wanted more autonomy, right? Well, that's a tension to manage. If you solve the problem, you have to pick one of the two. And by solving the problem, picking one of the two, you lose the power of the dynamic that's making it greater by keeping it there. So in the Popeye situation, if you gave the local stores complete autonomy to run everything the way they want, imagine how many Popeyes logos we would see just driving down the street. Imagine how many different kinds of cooking of sandwiches we would have. How many, I mean, again, hopefully we wouldn't get this far, but cooking times and temperatures. We don't want a lot of deviation on that, right? So, but giving that much autonomy would solve the problem. Everybody would stop complaining in the field, yet it wouldn't lead to the better solution. The opposite is true too, though. If you removed all agency from the local store owner, they couldn't contextualize anything in their local marketing for their local communities. They wouldn't be able to experiment possibly with different kinds of products, limited on some level, but still there's experimentation that happens. I mean, some of my favorite Chick-fil-A sauces came out of local stores testing and playing around with different sauces. The Chick-fil-A sauce is one of these. It wasn't created at corporate. It was created in the field by a local store because they had autonomy to experiment a little bit, but not completely. So that's a tension that has to be managed. In multi-site churches, it's the same thing. Every campus pastor wants full autonomy to do their own thing. Every central team wants the campus pastor just to run the playbook and stop asking questions. Neither one of those is the right choice in totality. keeping the tension between them is so helpful, so helpful.
When you mentioned the multi-site example and specifically what campus pastors want to do and kind of what is dictated that they should be doing, that reminds me of something I've been experiencing for the last couple of years as I've been consulting with organizations where there is this move towards centralization of shared services. Like as
Yeah.
soon as you start to combine companies, like, oh, why does that company, which by the way is a distinct brand and has its own product, its own audience, why do they have their own, say, marketing or finance department? Why don't we just have one central for everything? And I was talking with a leader about a year ago, this time a year ago, as they were starting to move towards centralization, and this was being celebrated as they were moving things towards, hey, we're going to have one marketing department, we're going to have one finance department, we're going to have one IT. Isn't this great that we've accomplished this? I said, watch out because something's about to come. You think that you're consolidating these disciplines into shared services model, and that you're thereby saving, not so much you're saving, you're preventing or you're causing silos to disintegrate. I said you're going to have other silos that pop up. Like if you think these different companies that now make this one company are no longer going to be a silo, now you're going to have departmental silos as opposed to
Yep.
brand silos, which is
Will,
basically what I've seen happen.
think about how in our previous conversation, though, just on leadership and management,
Mhm.
that is such a great management decision, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're going to combine services. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more effective. We think it's economies of scale. We're going to take advantage of
Mhm.
every economy of scale because of efficiency, of cost, of all those things. Meanwhile, we have lost something dynamic in the leadership side. So I talk about this in the book a lot, but management easily will overwhelm and take over leadership if we're not careful.
Mhm.
And in doing so, we lose the future because now we're just managing what's currently in existence. And by the way, in all these stories, Cheryl talked about this as well with Popeyes. I can talk about this from a church perspective for sure, having lived it. But when you move to central services, when you move more autonomy away from the location and more to central, it is simpler. It is somewhat cheaper. However, you lose leaders who are out in the field because a leader wants to lead. They don't want to just run a playbook. They don't want to be given by a central team the play and they're just run it, don't ask questions, and then turn around and do it again. You lose all of your leaders. So what happens in these organizations, and this is so unfortunate, but I see it all the time in the marketplace and in ministry and everywhere in between. The move to that central completely gets out of balance. If you move out of balance too far and you solve a problem, right? You solve a problem. Now we have created another problem that we didn't see coming, a massive lack of leadership in the field. And so where are your innovations coming from? Where is R&D? Where is that let's make the future better than the present? It's all gone. And now we have, and Frank Blake talked about this, now we have removed decision-making and removed leadership from the people closest to the customer, who, by the way, are the ones who are in the best position to help us move into the future with the customer, not the central team, who has no interactions with customers. So such a great example of attention to manage. If you solve it, you mess up the power that's found in the tension.
As you're saying that, I think of this specific example. There have been three major organizations that I've worked with in the last probably 12 or so years that have moved towards a shared services model for the major disciplines. They're like, hey, we're going to take this, and I love that you said out in the field, we're going to take this out of the field, away from the individual brands that make up this conglomerate. We're going to put it here. Did you know that? Okay, so there's lots of things I can say have happened within 6 weeks to a year after that decision was made and after that was implemented. But I can tell you there's one common thing that all three of those major organizations experienced after they instituted an abrupt shared services model. They all had a steep decline in revenue, every single one of them. That did this, and it's at both at the holistic level as well as at the individual, company or brand level. They all said, "Oh, what happened to our sales? We used to be able to do this. It was predictable. If we did this, we knew we were going to get this, and even what was predictable isn't predictable anymore." Um, One of the other tensions to manage that you mentioned that I'd love to get your thoughts on that you talk about in the book is team building versus building the team.
Mhm. One of the hardest things for a leader who's stepping into a new role. Now, there are lots of versions of this, and I, again, talk about this in the book, but you may be an internal promoted candidate. You may be coming in from the outside the organization. So however you arrive, there's so many different derivations, but however you arrive, there is a team in existence when you get there. And that team most likely was hired and built around the previous leader, your predecessor. No matter how similar you are to your predecessor, you're different. Therefore, that team is not going to fit you as well as it fit the previous leader. I mean, it's like the glove, right? You put the glove on, it's a little tight, a little too big. It just doesn't fit right. You put your foot in the shoe, it just doesn't feel right. There's something off about this. And what's off is that the things surrounding you aren't made to surround you. They were made to surround the previous leader. So a great leader will, recognize their strengths and weaknesses, their skills, their gaps, fill in those weaknesses and gaps with the team to help create a holistic experience, right? Well, now you're walking in, and so many leaders do this. They want to go on a retreat or get on a ropes course or whatever, and we're going to do some team building together. But the reality is that the team that you have might not be the right team. And so it's challenging. Again, I go through this in detail in the book, but we've got to figure out who we are first. We got to really know ourselves well, be very, very self-aware. EQ is so important in these things. EQ will destroy everything, right? Eventually, but it does this very quickly, destroys this transition very quickly. So we have to be very aware of ourselves. We also have to find out how to be aware of who we have around us. And how do we build relational influence with them and psychological safety in the team so that we can begin figuring out, to use the seats on the bus analogy, not necessarily how do we throw people off the bus, but how do we maybe rearrange some of the seats within the bus? How do we position people to be successful on the team with me as the leader now, not with who they had as the leader? And so I think about, though, how tough that is for all the people walking in. I mean, the minute that the predecessor said, I've got some news to share, everybody got real nervous real quick, right? And this is why they know that things are going to be different and they don't know how it's going to affect them. And so they're living in this state of limbo. The faster we can get through that, the better. And if we have a plan in place to do that, practically, tactically, but also emotionally, understanding what they're feeling and leading them through those feelings, we can get to the other side of those conversations, not too quickly, but faster than maybe if we didn't have a holistic plan walking in.
Wasn't planning on asking you this, so I'll throw you a curveball. I'll give you a question that you weren't
Sure.
expecting. If there was, other than your book, which comes out on January 16th, Big Shoes to Fill, if there were 3 leadership books that you would recommend that someone read starting January 1st, and again, in addition to your book, you're like, look, these are the 3 books right now that if you read them, they will be practical, they will be applicable, and they will shortcut your way to leadership success. What would those be?
Wow, that's a tough question off the cuff because I did read a lot. In the church space, if I could maybe deviate a little bit on that, on the church space, I would read The Great Dechurching. It is fantastic. I think it is so good. From a pure leadership space, I don't know how to say this without, this is going to sound terrible. I feel like so many leadership books I read feel like blog posts that got turned into 200-page. So there's not a lot of great ones, to be honest. There are some good, but they're classic ones. So now I'm going to say anything you haven't heard before in that realm, right? One of my all-time favorites, so these aren't new. One of my all-time favorites is Lincoln on Leadership. It is fantastic. And it really delves into how Abraham Lincoln surrounded himself with people to help him lead better. But the people he surrounded himself by were nothing like him. In fact, he invited several opponents to be in his cabinet. And so Lincoln on Leadership was a formulative book for me earlier in my leadership journey. I also, as crazy as this isn't crazy, it's very popular, but Brene Brown's book, Dare to, what was the one? I've read 3 or 4 of hers. I can't remember which one this one was, but there's one where she talks so much about culture and building culture and how to identify what culture is. That's incredible. It's such a good book. William Vanderbloom wrote a book not too long ago on leadership called Culture Wins. I loved it as well. It was so helpful. But I'm going to lean more. I said that kind of jerkily earlier. It's a joke, but so many leadership books are just principles and without tactical, practical advice on how to do it. So the books I'm leaning towards are things that are not just principled, but very helpful, that are helping you implement, not just helping you think about a principle or identify something you haven't thought of before. So the Brene Brown's, the William Vanderbloom's book, the Culture Wins book, those things they're just really, really helpful.
I'll say this for those that haven't seen it, Joe. Your book is very meaty, so it did take me two sittings, 2 days to read it. Not two like 24-hour days, but like literally an
Yeah.
hour one day, the hour the next day.
Yeah.
And I will say that it was so practical that if someone, an organizational leader, is trying to lead through change, or they're leading through succession, or they're just leading their leadership team through a certain season, they could literally turn to a couple of chapters and say, okay, for the next X number of weeks, we're going to tackle,
Right.
a page a day. I mean, they can literally say, let's address this. This is the elephant in the room. This is something that we know deep down is true, but maybe we haven't put words to it. Here, Gavin has put words to it, and we can discuss this. We can reach some decisions. And for a lot of it, it is literally coming to an understanding. Because to me, if all a leader in an organization did was look at the problems to solve versus the tensions to manage, and really come to an understanding with their leadership team. Okay, guys, we've been looking at this particular thing all wrong. This is not a problem to solve. It's tension managed, or in rare cases, the other way around. It would be super useful. So I would say in whatever format that a leader can get it, please get the book and please go through it yourself, apply the principles. And if you're someone that's going to deal with any type of transition, succession, anything like that, you need to get the book and consume it, memorize it if you have to, because it's that important and it's that useful to what you're going to be trying to do. So again, the book comes out January 16th. For the few thousand people that will watch this before January 16th, are there any kind of pre-order specials? And if so, where should they
Yeah.
get the book?
Well, and I mentioned earlier, I'm just so driven to creating practical, helpful stuff, right? Not just principled. I love that about this book. So if you just go to my website, gavinadams.com, there's a link to the book stuff, pre-order stuff. And if you order one book, I give you some resources. If you order 5 or more, I give you everything I got on it. So, but the thing I'm most proud of is, and I mentioned this earlier, is in the book, there are several different ways you can find yourself stepping into a new leadership space. And so I have 10 different versions of this that are companion guides, depending on your situation, that can walk you through the book. And I just give a bunch of content in addition to the book for each chapter throughout the book to help you contextualize your situation with what you're reading in the book. So if you're replacing a beloved leader, it's very different than replacing a leader who maybe wasn't so liked. If you are internally promoted versus externally coming into the organization, I interviewed government officials. That's an elected position. That's a unique space to step into. When you inherit, the mayor in my town inherited 250 staff members the day he was elected. So how do you do that well? I worked with some teachers and principals in the academic world, because everything about this, every school year, teachers are a new leader stepping into a new space with 15, 20, 30 new little kids that they're leading. It's a brand new experience for all of them. So there are so many areas that this is applicable. Those companion guides help contextualize each of those different areas.
GavinAdams.com. And I think if my math is correct in my head here, I've probably known you for about 6 years now. Again, we did some work together.
Yeah, at least.
And
Yeah.
and you were a great leader and a very accomplished leader back then. But just reading your book, I didn't know the tenth of it, like just how much wisdom you had stored up. I'm not sure how much of that you learned, since I met you 6 years ago. But this is incredible. I definitely want to do this again. I definitely let's have you on again. We can unpack some more of your book and also some of the other work
Yeah.
that you're doing. What's next on the horizon for you, and what's your day-to-day job, and what kind of services do you provide for people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's next? I hope is a whole bunch more of what I'm doing. I'm having so much fun, Will, right now, working directly with leaders and organizations, and truly having partnerships with organizations and leaders, helping them over the long term develop better team chemistry, better team cultures, organizational staff cultures. I use the little phrase a lot, helping add intention to the mission, but helping leaders become more intentional about what they do with their team, but also within their organization. So again, that divides out into coaching leaders one-on-one a lot and directly, and then also coaching, consulting with organizations to help them identify what they're currently doing, what they wish they could get to do, and how do we get there. So I do a lot of that day in and day out. Of course, do a lot of speaking, a lot of conferences, organizational stuff. And again, came out of the market, I'm out of ministry. So I do a lot of preaching and things like that on the weekends too.
And what's the best way for leaders that are interested in working with you? What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. On my website, again, there's a contact us, or shoot me an email, Gavin@gavinadams.com.
Awesome. Gavinadams.com. Folks, get the book, Big Shoes to Fill, Stepping into a Leadership Role Without Stepping in It. You need to get it. It's going to be a huge benefit to you and to the organization that you lead. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.